In 1985, a mother and daughter vanished after a routine gas station stop, leaving behind only heartbreak and questions. 16 years later, their rusted car is found hidden behind a billboard, reigniting a decades-old mystery that leads to a chilling confession, an unexpected reunion, and a haunting truth that was buried in plain sight. The summer of 1985 was already sweltering by the first week of June. A stretch of two-lane highway cut through the Oklahoma countryside, its pavement shimmering under the midday sun. Patricia Moore adjusted her sunglasses, glancing at the rearview mirror. Her 6-year-old daughter, Emily, sat in the back seat humming to herself, legs swinging beneath her booster seat, surrounded by crumpled snack wrappers and a Barbie doll missing its left shoe. Patricia smiled faintly. They'd made good time so far. The drive from Dallas to her sister's house in Kansas had gone smoothly until Emily insisted she needed the bathroom. Patricia had spotted a faded sign for a gas station a few miles back and taken the next exit. The station wasn't much to look at, one of those lonely roadside stops with a rusting ice machine out front and a soda machine that buzzed louder than it worked. A man in overalls nodded at them from beneath the hood of an old pickup. Patricia lifted Emily out of the car, brushing the dust from the little girl's sneakers before guiding her toward the restroom around the side of the building. Inside, the store smelled like motor oil and sunflower seeds. A fan turned lazily in the corner. Patricia paid for a soda and a pack of gum, exchanged a few polite words with the clerk, and gave Emily a chance to choose a piece of candy for the road. That was the last confirmed sighting of either of them. They never made it to Kansas. When Patricia's sister called to ask if they'd left late, Patricia's parents assumed the same. When night fell and there was still no word, Jason, her 10-year-old son who'd stayed behind with his grandparents due to a summer cold, asked a question he'd repeat for years: "Why hasn't Mom called?" Police scoured the highways for any sign of Patricia's car. Her Dodge Aries had a distinctive dent in the rear bumper and a missing hubcap, but not a single sighting was reported. No skid marks, no broken guardrails, no calls from hospitals. It was as if the road had simply swallowed them whole. Jason, barely tall enough to reach the phone on his own, sat in silence that night, staring out the window, waiting for headlights that never came. By the following morning, a missing persons report had been filed, and state troopers were combing the area around the gas station. A helicopter was dispatched to survey the stretches of highway between Dallas and Wichita, while local law enforcement retraced Patricia's known route. Flyers were printed and posted in convenience stores and post offices, bearing the black and white photo of a smiling Patricia holding Emily in her lap at a 4th of July picnic the year before. Her car was described in detail, a light blue 1980 Dodge Aries with a small dent on the right rear bumper and a handmade baby on board sign taped inside the back window. It should have been easy to spot, but it wasn't. Search dogs were brought in to sweep the area behind the gas station, the ditches along the highway shoulders, and the woods behind a nearby rest stop. Every tip called in brought a flicker of hope, and every dead end chipped away at the family's resolve. Patricia's husband, already in poor health from a heart condition, refused interviews. Jason, too young to fully understand the weight of what was happening, asked questions that adults couldn't answer. At school, kids whispered. Some said she ran off. Others said the girl was kidnapped by someone from the gas station. There were no answers to quiet the noise. The weeks stretched into months. Police followed up on a witness who thought she saw a similar car parked on an overgrown service road behind a row of billboards along Highway 77. By the time officers arrived, the car was gone, if it had ever been there. The location was dismissed as a mistake or a false lead, one of hundreds that would come over the next year. The gas station clerk was questioned again, along with a man who had been fixing a truck out front that day, but both passed polygraphs. There was no crime scene, no blood, no personal items left behind. It was a disappearance without evidence, and as time wore on, the public's interest faded. What remained was a boy growing up in a home that felt permanently paused, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. By the spring of 1986, the official search had slowed to a trickle. The highway patrol moved on to more active cases, and the flyers curled at the corners under layers of sun and wind. Jason, now 11, quietly removed the one taped to the door of his school when it began to yellow. At home, the house grew quieter with each passing season. His grandparents spoke in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't listening, and his father, never much of a talker to begin with, withdrew further into himself. Meals became shorter. Conversations dried up. And Jason started writing letters to his mother and folding them into the pages of a school notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. Despite the silence, Patricia's sister Karen never stopped pressing. Every few months, she called local news stations, mailed updated photos, and reached out to private investigators. She believed Patricia had been taken, not run off, not lost. Someone had taken her, and maybe Emily too, and for years she begged law enforcement to re-examine old leads. The man at the gas station, a pickup truck someone claimed to have seen idling behind them on the road, a noise in the woods reported by a hunter weeks later. Each possibility raised, explored briefly, and eventually filed away. When the gas station shut down in 1989, a new family bought the property and turned it into a feed store. They found nothing unusual during renovations. No hidden room, no disturbed earth. Nothing left behind except oil stains and silence. The mystery faded into local legend. Patricia and Emily's names were mentioned now and then in true crime forums or the rare TV segment about cold cases, but no new information ever surfaced. Over time, it became one of those stories that older residents remembered vaguely and younger ones barely knew. For Jason, though, there was no forgetting. The image of his mother waving through the car window and Emily blowing a kiss from the back seat was frozen in his mind. He replayed that moment often, the sound of the tires crunching gravel as they pulled away, not knowing that it would be the last time he'd ever see them. By the time Jason turned 20, his childhood home felt more like a museum than a place anyone truly lived in. The rooms hadn't changed. His mother's purse still hung on the hook near the front door, dusty but untouched, and Emily's favorite doll sat on the living room shelf beside a fading school photo. His father rarely left the house except for work, and stopped attending church altogether. Grief had calcified into routine, and conversations between them became functional, quiet, and brief. Jason often thought about leaving Oklahoma for good, but something kept him tethered, like the answer might still be hidden somewhere close if he just looked hard enough. In college, he studied criminal justice, though he rarely told people why. When classmates asked about his interest in cold cases, he'd offer something vague. Only one professor knew the full story, a former investigator who took a particular interest in Jason's drive and encouraged him to look through archived missing persons files at the state level. He did, poring over old notes, police reports, and maps that covered every mile Patricia might have traveled that day. Each familiar name brought back a memory. Each photograph of her Dodge Aries, its make, model, the missing hubcap, tightened something in his chest. He kept coming back to one location that had always bothered him. A small side road behind a line of aging billboards about 10 miles from the gas station. It was mentioned once in the original file when a caller thought they saw a car parked back there, but no follow-up photos or interviews had been attached. Jason drove the road himself several times. Overgrown and cracked with weeds, it led behind several billboards in various states of collapse, most advertising long-defunct businesses or faded phone numbers. He walked the area more than once, notebook in hand, listening to the sounds of the wind cutting through the tall grass and wondering how something so obvious could have been overlooked. What haunted him most was the sheer banality of the spot. Hidden, yes, but not remote, not impossible to find. It made him wonder whether whoever was responsible had counted on that very thing. That no one would ever think to look just far enough off the road to miss what had been there all along. 16 years passed before anyone looked behind the billboard again, and even then, it wasn't because of the case. In the spring of 2001, an advertising company sent a maintenance crew to dismantle an old wooden billboard that had partially collapsed during a thunderstorm. The structure had stood untouched for decades, warped by weather and overtaken by vines. As the workers began cutting away the support beams and clearing brush around the base, one of them noticed something out of place tucked beneath layers of honeysuckle and dry leaves, a patch of faded blue metal, barely visible through the tangle of undergrowth. At first they assumed it was junk, maybe a discarded farm truck or an old appliance dumped long ago. But as more of the vines were cleared, the shape of a car slowly emerged, sunken into the soft earth. The tires had long since deflated, the windshield clouded with grime and spiderwebs. What little paint remained was dull and flaking, but the shape was unmistakable. One worker stepped back and radioed his supervisor. When local deputies arrived, they pushed through the brush and read the partial license plate beneath layers of rust. It matched the one issued to Patricia Moore in 1985. The area was quickly cordoned off as detectives and crime scene technicians descended on the site. Forensics experts moved carefully around the vehicle, noting the trunk's warped seam and a long, jagged scrape along the driver's side. The car had been positioned deliberately, angled just far enough off the service road to be obscured by the billboard's shadow, yet close enough to be hiding in plain sight all those years. There were no broken windows, no immediate signs of struggle visible from the outside, but when the trunk was finally pried open, the air shifted. Inside, wrapped in a tattered blanket, were the skeletal remains of an adult woman. Dental records would later confirm what Jason already knew the moment the call came: his mother had been found. Her car had been no more than 12 miles from where she was last seen, parked behind a sign advertising fried chicken and motel rates that hadn't existed since the late 80s. As the remains were carefully removed and catalogued, one terrifying detail settled in: the second body, Emily's, was not there. News of the discovery spread quickly. By the end of the week, television crews had set up just beyond the yellow tape, broadcasting grainy shots of the rusted Dodge as investigators worked through wind and dust. Jason stood behind them, hands in his pockets, staring at the place he had walked past more than once, never knowing what lay just feet away. He had always imagined finding her would feel like a kind of relief, a breaking of the spell that had held him in place for so many years. But there was no comfort in it. Just the bitter confirmation that his mother had been close all along and that no one had thought to look closely enough. He was taken to the local sheriff's office and briefed by the lead detective, a man who had been a young deputy back when the case first broke. The detective's face was worn, lined by time and regret. He apologized more than once. Jason didn't answer. He sat stiffly as they walked him through what little they could say. Patricia's remains had been found wrapped in a blanket in the trunk, consistent with decomposition over a long period. There were no immediate signs of trauma to the bones, but forensic analysis would take time. A child's shoe was found beneath the driver's seat, aged and cracked, pink plastic faded nearly white. The car seat was still buckled in the back, empty. When they asked if he wanted to see it, he said yes. They led him under the flapping tape toward the vehicle. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the broken taillight and the dent in the bumper he remembered from childhood. The interior was hollowed out, stripped by time and animals, but there were flashes of familiarity. A melted cassette tape, the edge of a coloring book. His mother's sunglasses, one lens missing, still resting in the console tray. What struck him most was the silence. For years, he had imagined the moment they were taken, the chaos, the violence. But the car looked like it had simply been left there and forgotten. No shattered glass or torn fabric to tell a story. Only absence. And in that absence, the terrifying realization that Emily might still be out there, somewhere. The coroner's report arrived 3 weeks later, confirming what investigators had suspected but couldn't say aloud. The remains in the trunk were definitively identified as Patricia Moore through dental records, and the condition of the bones suggested she had died shortly after the time of her disappearance. There was no evidence of a gunshot wound or blunt force trauma, but 2 ribs showed faint signs of stress fractures, the kind that could have resulted from a violent struggle or a heavy blow. It wasn't conclusive, but it pointed toward foul play. What the report didn't include, and what Jason had braced himself for, was any mention of Emily. For the second time in his life, he sat in a police station as an officer explained that his mother was gone and his sister was missing. Except this time, there was no ambiguity about Patricia. There would be a funeral, a body to bury. But for Emily, there was only silence. No trace in the car, no signs of remains nearby. The area behind the billboard was searched again, this time with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, but the only thing they uncovered were beer cans and animal bones. It was as if Emily had vanished a second time, this time even more completely. The sheriff's office reopened the case and assigned a new team to work through the old files. Boxes of paperwork were brought out of storage, yellowed forms and faded photographs spread across tables in a makeshift command center. Jason was invited to review some of the personal effects recovered from the car. He sat in a quiet room and unzipped a plastic evidence bag to reveal the cracked pink shoe they'd found under the seat. He held it in his hand longer than he expected to, surprised by how small it was, how it still smelled faintly of old plastic and dust. He wasn't sure what haunted him more, the fact that Emily's body hadn't been found, or the possibility that she hadn't died that day at all, that someone had taken her, raised her, lied to her, that somewhere she might be alive, completely unaware of who she really was. The idea seemed impossible, but so had finding the car. And if that could happen, then maybe the door hadn't fully closed yet. Maybe, just maybe, the search wasn't over. The reopening of the case breathed new life into old rumors. People who had long forgotten the details of Patricia and Emily's disappearance now remembered strange sightings, odd conversations, half-recalled anecdotes from the summer of 1985. A man came forward, saying he'd seen a blue car parked near the billboard around that time, but couldn't be sure of the make or model. Another claimed he remembered a child crying in the woods during a camping trip that same weekend, though he hadn't thought much of it at the time. The sheriff's department logged each report carefully, but after years of false leads and fading memories, separating truth from noise was nearly impossible. One lead, however, stood out. A retired trucker named Wesley Holt had driven Route 77 weekly during the 80s. After seeing the news about the car being discovered behind a billboard, he called investigators and asked whether they'd ever looked into a man who used to hang around that gas station. According to Holt, the man worked on cars in the back lot, offered to fix radiators for cash, and made more than a few people uncomfortable with how he watched women come and go. The original case file mentioned a mechanic on site that day, but only briefly. No charges had ever been filed. He'd passed a polygraph and was dismissed early on. Jason read through the interview transcripts and was struck by how thin the details were. No follow-up, no timeline, no verification of the man's alibi. Just a few pages of notes and a signature. The man's name was Frank Dillard. He would have been in his early 30s at the time, now nearing 50. When investigators attempted to contact him, they found he had moved to Arizona in the late 90s and was living under a slightly altered name, Francis Dale, a variation that barely masked his past. They filed a formal request to bring him in for questioning and requested a DNA sample. Jason wasn't sure what to expect. It could be a coincidence, a bad memory from a tired man. But the name echoed in his head all night, replaying over and over as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was the thread they had missed all along. The man now calling himself Francis Dale lived in a small rental outside Flagstaff, Arizona, tucked along a quiet stretch of highway lined with pine trees and rust-colored cliffs. He worked part-time at an auto salvage yard and kept mostly to himself, according to neighbors. No criminal record under his new name, no traffic tickets, no signs of trouble. But when detectives from Oklahoma arrived with a warrant for a DNA swab, his composure cracked. He didn't resist, but his hands trembled as he signed the consent form. He asked why they'd driven all the way out to see him, but the detectives gave only the standard answer, routine follow-up on an old cold case. Back in Oklahoma, the DNA sample was rushed through testing. Jason waited by the phone each day, checking it obsessively, even when he knew results would take time. He tried to temper his expectations, reminding himself that this man might be just another dead end. But he couldn't stop thinking about the old photo in the case file, a grainy Polaroid showing a group of men standing beside the gas station in the early 80s. One of them, tall and lean with a mustache and grease-streaked jeans, looked just like Francis Dale. That same tired squint, the same curl in his upper lip. Jason had stared at that photo so many times as a teenager, always wondering if one of those faces knew something he didn't. The results came in 8 days later. The sample from Francis was a match to a partial DNA profile found on the blanket that had covered Patricia's remains in the trunk. It wasn't enough to confirm guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it was enough to place him in her car. The weight of it hit Jason like a tide, slow and steady at first, then overwhelming. After years of unanswered questions, they finally had something solid, a connection, a name, a living person who could explain what happened that day. Francis was arrested without incident that evening. As he was led to the patrol car, one reporter managed to get close enough to ask, "Do you know what happened to the little girl?" Francis didn't speak. He just stared forward, eyes flat and empty, as if he were looking at something far away that no one else could see. At the county jail in Oklahoma, Francis Dale sat across from two detectives in a small, windowless interview room. The air was stale, and the fluorescent lighting buzzed softly above them. He kept his hands folded in his lap, a paper cup of water untouched at his side. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, the kind that made both men uneasy. They began with the basics, confirming his name, asking about his time working at the gas station in 1985 and whether he remembered Patricia Moore. At first, he claimed he didn't recognize the name, said a lot of people came and went, and 30 years was a long time to remember faces. But when they showed him the picture of Patricia and Emily standing at the counter, his expression changed. He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the photo for just a moment too long. They shifted to the car. He denied ever seeing it before. They asked how his DNA ended up on a blanket wrapped around Patricia's body. His only response was a shrug, followed by a muttered suggestion that maybe he used to sell blankets out of the back, maybe someone bought one. But the detectives didn't let up. They told him the blanket had been inside the trunk of a car, hidden behind a billboard for 16 years, along with Patricia's remains. They told him a little girl was missing and likely still out there somewhere. For a flicker of a second, something in his face shifted, a tightening of the jaw, a barely perceptible shake of the head. Then, he leaned back and said he wanted a lawyer. The interview ended, but the momentum didn't. Prosecutors now had enough to charge him with evidence tampering and obstruction, and the murder investigation was officially underway. Jason sat in the district attorney's office when the news came through. He didn't feel triumph, not even relief, just a grim sense of gravity. They finally had someone accountable, but it was only half the story. The man who may have killed his mother was now in custody, but the whereabouts of Emily were still a blank page. Until that part was answered, the weight of uncertainty would remain, heavy and constant, pressing on every breath. A week after his arrest, Francis Dale's public defender filed a motion to suppress the DNA evidence, claiming the warrant was too broad. The judge denied it, but the delay stalled the interrogation. Investigators pressed forward with what they had, combing through archived employment records, credit history, and property transactions linked to Francis's real and assumed names. The goal was to establish a timeline, to find out where he had been in the months after Patricia and Emily disappeared. They needed to know whether he had the means and opportunity to take a child and cover it up for good. The picture that emerged was troubling. In the summer of 1985, Francis had abruptly left Oklahoma, quitting his job at the gas station without notice. He'd sold his truck a few days later, left no forwarding address, and didn't appear in any formal records again until 2 years later under a new name in New Mexico. There, he worked for a roofing company, rented a small apartment, and had no known family or relationships. He kept to himself, paid in cash when he could, and never stayed anywhere long. When investigators reached out to former co-workers, most barely remembered him. One woman recalled a child, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, who sometimes sat in his truck while he worked. But she couldn't remember her name or describe her in detail. At the time, she assumed she was his daughter. That statement alone was enough to widen the investigation. If the girl had been Emily, it meant she might have been alive for months, maybe longer. It raised the terrifying possibility that she hadn't been killed at all, but taken and passed off as someone else. The FBI was contacted to assist with adoption and guardianship records from the late 1980s. Back then, private adoptions were easier to arrange under the radar, especially in rural areas with loose oversight. Agents began cross-referencing names, locations, and paperwork for inconsistencies. Jason followed every update from the edge of exhaustion. He didn't know what to wish for anymore. The thought of Emily growing up under someone else's name was almost harder than imagining she hadn't survived. But if she had lived, and if she was out there somewhere, then he had to believe she deserved the truth. Even if it came decades too late. The next break in the case came not from law enforcement, but from a retired social worker who had seen a local news segment about the reopened investigation. She called the tip line after seeing Emily's childhood photo on the screen and said the face had looked eerily familiar. In 1986, she had been working at a small private clinic in Topeka, Kansas, helping oversee emergency placements for children whose guardians couldn't be identified. She remembered a girl, about 6 years old, who had been dropped off late one evening by a man who gave a fake name and vanished before anyone could question him. The child had no ID, didn't speak much, and had bruises that were reported but never followed up on properly. The man claimed to be her uncle. The file was sparse, but she remembered the girl's eyes. Wide, uncertain, with a specific way of tilting her head when she was confused or scared. The same expression she saw in the photo of Emily Moore on her television. The name the girl had been assigned was Anna Collins. She was placed with a foster family in Wichita after 2 months, then formally adopted the following year. The records from that time weren't digitized, but the paper trail still existed. It took 2 days for the FBI to get access, and another 3 to locate the current address of the woman now legally known as Anna Marie Collins, age 22, living in Kansas City and working as a veterinary assistant. Jason was told in person. The agents were careful, reminding him that nothing was confirmed, that they were proceeding with caution, but he could already feel something shifting inside him. For years, he'd imagined seeing his sister again, played out conversations in his head that blurred with the voices in his dreams. The possibility that she might be alive had never truly gone away, only dulled by time and disappointment. Now, it was returning fast, sharp and bright, almost too much to hold. He sat in silence after they left, staring at a childhood photo of Emily on the mantel, wondering what her face looked like now and if she remembered anything about the day their lives had been torn apart. The FBI made contact with Anna Collins under the guise of a routine background check tied to a distant adoption inquiry. They didn't want to overwhelm her or disrupt her life without certainty. She agreed to meet in a neutral setting, curious but not alarmed, unaware of the weight her story carried. The agents described their work in general terms at first, asking about her childhood, where she had grown up, and whether she remembered anything from before her adoption. Anna was polite, thoughtful in her answers, but said she had few memories from early childhood, only flashes of riding in a car, the smell of bubble gum, and a woman singing softly off-key to the radio. She didn't know who the woman was. Her adoptive parents had told her she'd come from an unstable family situation, that she'd been abandoned, and that there was no information about her birth relatives. She never pressed them for more. The agents asked if she would be willing to submit to a voluntary DNA test. She hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because no one had ever suggested she might be connected to something larger. They assured her it was only to help close a very old file, and she agreed, signing the paperwork with steady hands. After she left, one agent stayed behind in the parking lot, watching as she drove away, noting how she adjusted her mirror and tapped twice on the steering wheel, small habits that mirrored the footage of Patricia from the gas station surveillance tape. Back in Oklahoma, Jason waited. He had spent the past few days in a restless daze, caught between disbelief and fragile hope. The thought of seeing his sister again after all these years was almost too large to picture. Would she want to meet him? Would she believe him? Would she remember anything at all? He didn't expect perfect answers. He just needed to know she had made it out, that she hadn't been lost in the same way their mother had. That somewhere in the wreckage of that terrible summer, someone had survived. The DNA results would take several days, but already Jason felt the pull of a truth slowly making its way toward the surface. 3 days later, the call came. Jason had just stepped out of the shower when the phone rang, and he nearly let it go to voicemail. But something made him answer. Towel still around his neck, feet wet on the tile. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, but the words came with quiet gravity. The DNA results were back. Anna Collins was, with a probability exceeding 99.99%, Emily Moore. Jason didn't respond at first. He simply closed his eyes, leaned against the bathroom doorframe, and let the truth settle over him like a weight and a blessing all at once. Emily was alive. She had lived. While their mother's car sat hidden and rusting beneath a billboard for 16 years, Emily had gone to school, learned to ride a bike, maybe had sleepovers and scraped knees in birthday parties. All the ordinary moments of childhood that Jason had once pictured frozen in time were real, unfolding across the years while he remained in the dark. It was almost too much to comprehend. He didn't cry, not right away. It took hours before the emotions caught up, and when they did, they arrived not as a burst but a slow, steady unraveling. Arrangements were made quickly. Emily was contacted by agents who explained the situation in more detail, carefully and with compassion. She was stunned. At first, she didn't believe it. Her adoptive parents had passed away years earlier, and she had no one to confirm or challenge the story. But when they showed her the photographs, Patricia holding her as a toddler, Jason at 10 years old, grinning in a backyard covered in dandelions, she began to cry. Not from recognition, but from the ache of something deep and unnamed that had lived in her for as long as she could remember, a feeling that something in her story had never made sense. She agreed to meet Jason. They would take it slow, they both said, acknowledging how much time had passed, how many lives had been lived between then and now. But beneath all the caution was one simple, undeniable truth: they had found each other. And for the first time since that awful day in 1985, neither of them was alone. They met in a quiet park on the edge of Kansas City, early on a cool morning just after sunrise. Jason arrived first and sat on a bench beneath a cottonwood tree, palms damp and heart pounding harder than he'd expected. He had no idea what to say or how to begin, so he focused on the little things: the sound of birds in the distance, the sharp scent of dew-soaked grass, the way the sunlight moved through the trees. He hadn't told anyone about the meeting, hadn't rehearsed anything. This was between them, just them. Emily arrived a few minutes later, walking slowly, almost cautiously, as if unsure whether to keep going or turn around. She wore jeans and a pale blue jacket, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Jason stood when he saw her, unsure whether to wave or move forward. She stopped a few feet away, looking at him with a strange mixture of nervousness and wonder. Then, without a word, she stepped closer and hugged him. It wasn't a dramatic, tear-filled embrace. It was quiet and tentative, the way people hug when they're still trying to understand what's real. But Jason felt something shift in that moment, a kind of alignment, like two pieces of a story finally placed side by side. When they sat down, she smiled nervously and admitted she didn't remember much. Just flashes. A stuffed animal, the color of the car's seats, a warm voice singing to her. But she said she'd always felt like there was a hole in her past, a blank she couldn't explain, and now she knew why. They talked for over an hour. About their childhoods, the people who raised them, what had been lost and what might still be found. Jason told her about their mother, about the way she laughed at her own jokes and how she always burned toast on purpose because she liked it that way. Emily listened with tears in her eyes, pressing her sleeves to her cheeks when they spilled over. Neither of them tried to solve everything in one meeting. There was too much history, too many unanswered questions. But as the sun rose higher and the park grew warmer, they both felt something they hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. Quiet, tentative, but real. After that first meeting, Jason and Emily began speaking regularly. It started with cautious phone calls, short and slightly formal, but slowly grew into longer conversations that felt more natural with each passing week. Emily asked questions about their mother, their grandparents, what she had been like as a little girl. Jason answered everything he could, digging up old photo albums and childhood keepsakes stored in boxes he hadn't opened in years. He mailed her copies of family photos and even sent her one of the birthday cards their mom had saved from Emily's third birthday, the handwriting still neat and careful, as if Patricia had known somehow that it might be read again one day far in the future. Meanwhile, the investigation into Francis Dale moved forward. Prosecutors were building a murder case with the evidence they had, and while the forensic link between him and Patricia's remains was strong, the most chilling details came from witness statements slowly being pieced together. Two people from his past described a child matching Emily's description being seen in his company during the months after the disappearance. One neighbor recalled hearing a girl crying late at night, though she'd assumed it was the television. Another remembered seeing him throw away a box of children's clothing behind a gas station in New Mexico. Faced with mounting pressure, Francis finally agreed to a plea deal in exchange for providing a full statement. What he gave them was fragmented and disturbing. He claimed he had followed Patricia's car from the gas station, made her pull over near the service road by pretending something was wrong with her vehicle. He said he panicked during an argument and struck her, then stuffed her into the trunk. He didn't elaborate on the hours that followed, but admitted to abandoning the car behind the billboard. As for Emily, he said only that she was left with someone who would take care of her. When pressed for details, he shut down and refused to say more. It wasn't closure, not fully, but it was enough for prosecutors to move forward with charges of second-degree murder and kidnapping. Jason didn't attend the arraignment. Instead, he spent that morning on the phone with Emily, both of them talking quietly, slowly, as if the weight of the past needed to be unpacked one memory at a time. Emily began therapy soon after learning the truth, a step she took not because anyone pushed her, but because something inside her needed a place to make sense of the fractures in her life. The memories came in flashes, disjointed images of a long drive through the night, a strange man's voice, the hum of static on a car radio. Sometimes she dreamed of a hallway with peeling wallpaper and a room that smelled of mildew and smoke. Other times there was only the echo of her own voice calling for someone who never answered. Her therapist explained that trauma, especially experienced so young, often buries itself deep, surfacing only when the mind is ready. Emily wasn't sure she wanted to remember it all. Some of it felt too dark to bring forward, but other parts, the good ones, the ones Jason helped her rediscover, she clung to with quiet determination. Jason continued sending her pieces of the life she'd missed. A cassette tape their mom had recorded for a cousin where Patricia's voice could be heard reading a children's story over the sound of Emily giggling in the background. A crayon, drawing labeled Mommy and Emmy, that had once been taped to the refrigerator. A picture of the three of them sitting on a picnic blanket, squinting into the sun, long before any of them knew what was coming. Emily said she didn't recognize her own handwriting in the drawing, but the sound of her laugh on the cassette made something in her chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. The public reaction to the case had shifted too. Local news covered the story again, this time with a tone of somber vindication. The hidden car behind the billboard became a symbol of overlooked truths and long-buried answers. Strangers began leaving flowers at the site, small tokens of respect for a mother lost and a child found. Jason visited the spot once more, alone, standing in the same patch of earth that had held his family's final moments in silence for 16 years. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to ask. The questions hadn't all been answered, but enough had been brought to light for the grieving to begin in full. And, for the first time since that summer day in 1985, there was room for something other than pain to grow. As the trial date approached, the weight of the past began to shift into something more tangible. Prosecutors had enough evidence to pursue a conviction, but they knew the case hinged on two things: the DNA tying Frances Dale to Patricia's body, and the pattern of behavior that suggested premeditation. There were no eyewitnesses, no surveillance beyond that brief moment at the gas station, and no confession that offered clarity. Still, the state pushed forward, determined to deliver justice in a case that had gone unanswered far too long. Emily was not required to testify, and after long discussions with her therapist and the prosecution team, she chose not to. She was still rebuilding, still unpacking what it meant to have lived her entire life under a name and history that had been constructed to hide someone else's crimes. Jason, however, agreed to take the stand. He spoke not just about his mother and sister's disappearance, but about the years that followed, the silence, the rumors, the nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what he had missed. He described the moment he found out they'd found the car, the way the air seemed to leave the room when the phone rang, and how seeing Emily again after all those years felt like touching something sacred and broken at the same time. The defense argued that the passage of time had blurred the facts. They claimed Frances's DNA could have been transferred under innocent circumstances, that he might have known Patricia casually but had nothing to do with her death. They painted him as a man with a troubled past, not a killer. But the jury saw through the attempts to rewrite the narrative. The evidence, while incomplete, spoke louder than the excuses. And when the verdict came back guilty on charges of second-degree murder and kidnapping, the courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobbing of a woman in the back row who had followed the case since the very beginning. After the sentencing, Jason and Emily didn't celebrate. There was no victory in it, just a solemn acknowledgement that the person who had shattered their lives would finally face consequences. That night, Jason sat alone with an old photograph in his hands. Patricia holding Emily on her hip, both of them squinting into the sun, and whispered, not to the photo, but to the quiet space around him, "You're safe now." With the trial behind them, life began to unfold in a quieter rhythm. Emily took time off work, choosing to step away from the routines that had once given her comfort but now felt strangely disconnected. She moved into a small apartment on the edge of town and began working part-time at an animal shelter, finding peace in caring for things that couldn't speak but still needed love. Her therapist encouraged her to focus on building new associations with her identity. It wasn't about erasing the past, but weaving the two halves of her life into something whole. She began keeping a journal, one entry at a time, slowly filling the pages with moments that helped her feel rooted again. Jason, meanwhile, returned to work, but found himself pausing more often during the day, caught in waves of memory or reflection. The case was no longer a question mark hanging over him, but its echoes lingered. He stayed in close contact with Emily, sometimes visiting her on weekends, bringing old photos and stories she had never heard. They would sit on her small patio in the evenings, watching the sky shift colors, exchanging details from their separate lives like puzzle pieces that didn't always fit but still mattered. One afternoon, Emily asked him about their grandparents, about the house they used to visit every summer. Jason smiled and described the smell of fresh bread in the kitchen, the creak of the floorboards near the back bedroom, the way their grandfather used to hum when he thought no one was listening. Emily closed her eyes and said she didn't remember any of it, but the details still made her feel something, warmth maybe, or the edge of something familiar she couldn't quite reach. They decided, together, to visit their mother's grave. It was the first time Emily had been. She stood quietly beside Jason as he laid a single white flower at the base of the headstone. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. Emily didn't speak at first. She simply rested her hand on the stone, fingers tracing the name carved into it, and let herself feel the weight of the moment. Not grief, exactly. Something softer, something like belonging. For the first time in her adult life, she knew where she came from. As the seasons changed, so did the silence between the moments. What had once been heavy and filled with unanswered questions now held something softer, more open. Emily and Jason fell into the rhythm of siblings learning each other all over again. They shared meals, music, old family recipes, and long walks through the neighborhoods where Patricia had once lived. Emily asked about birthdays and holidays, about what kind of cartoons she used to like, or if she had a favorite bedtime story. Jason did his best to remember, digging deep into corners of his memory that had gone untouched for years. Sometimes the answers came easy, other times not at all, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the connection they were building in the present. The media attention faded as new stories took the spotlight. The court proceedings were over, the investigation officially closed, and the headlines had quieted. But for Jason and Emily, the real work was just beginning. Healing didn't arrive with a verdict. It came slowly, in uneven steps, through the process of reclaiming a shared history that had nearly been erased. Emily started volunteering at a support group for adult adoptees, offering guidance not from a place of certainty but from lived experience. Jason took a short sabbatical and began writing about the case, not as a journalist, but as a brother, trying to preserve what had nearly been lost to time. One weekend, they drove to the small Oklahoma town where it had all started. The gas station was long gone, replaced by a tire shop and a sandwich counter. The Billboard site had been cleared, the land now covered in wild grass and saplings. They parked nearby and walked together along the old service road. Jason pointed out where the car had been found, how he'd stood in that very spot, staring at the crumpled metal, not knowing what answers it held. Emily stood beside him quietly, letting the breeze wash over her face. She reached down and picked a sprig of clover, holding it between her fingers. No words were spoken, and none were needed. That patch of ground no longer held just grief. It held memory, and truth, and the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for, peace. Later that year, Jason and Emily were invited to speak at a victims' advocacy event in Tulsa. The organizers had followed their story and asked if they would be willing to share their journey, not for sensationalism, but to highlight the importance of cold case work and the power of persistence. They were hesitant at first. Neither of them had sought the spotlight, and the idea of standing in front of strangers, peeling back the layers of a deeply personal tragedy, was daunting. But after talking it over, they agreed. If their experience could help even one person feel less alone, it was worth it. The auditorium was modest, filled mostly with families of missing persons, survivors of violence, and the professionals who worked quietly behind the scenes to bring answers. When it was their turn to speak, Jason took the lead, his voice steady but raw as he described the 16 years of silence that followed his mother and sister's disappearance. He talked about the helplessness, the unanswered questions, and the long, aching process of holding on to hope even when it felt impossible. Then Emily stepped forward. She spoke gently, choosing her words with care. She talked about what it meant to grow up without a history, to feel like something vital had been cut out of her story without explanation. She described the day she learned who she truly was, and the quiet, powerful moment when she first called Jason her brother out loud. There wasn't a dry eye in the room by the time she finished. Not because of the pain, but because of the resilience threaded through it. Their story wasn't just about what had been taken, it was about what had been found. After the event, people lined up to speak with them. Some shared similar stories, others simply offered quiet thanks. A woman who had lost her sister in the 70s hugged Emily tightly and whispered, "You give me hope I didn't know I still had." That stayed with her. Later in the car, she told Jason it felt like they'd done something real that day, something that reached beyond their own healing. He nodded and said it felt like their mother would have been proud. And for the first time, they both believed that was true. In the months that followed the event in Tulsa, Emily began to piece together more fragments of her early years. They came to her in flashes, not always when she was trying. The smell of gas at a filling station would bring on a vague sense of fear. A lullaby heard in a grocery store made her pause, heart pounding, with the sudden sensation of being rocked in someone's arms. Most of the time the images didn't form clearly, but the feelings came through: warmth, panic, comfort, confusion. She shared each memory with Jason, not expecting answers, but wanting to let them live outside her head. He listened patiently, never rushing her, always reminding her that she owed herself nothing but the truth, whatever shape it took. Jason, too, was changing. For so long his identity had been tied to the search. Every decision, every direction his life had taken, had somehow led back to that one unresolved moment in 1985. Now, for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life built around something else. He started writing again, not just about the case, but about memory, time, and the strange ways grief and joy often run side by side. A small publisher reached out with interest in a memoir, and though the idea scared him at first, he accepted. Not to tell a story for shock value, but to honor the ones who never had a chance to finish their own. The siblings continued to spend time together, hiking local trails, cooking old family recipes, watching home movies Jason had converted from VHS tapes. In one grainy clip, Patricia could be seen helping Emily build a sandcastle, laughing as a wave knocked it over. Emily paused the tape and stared at the screen, her eyes soft. She didn't remember the beach, or the sand, or the sound of her mother's laugh. But watching it unfold gave her something she hadn't realized she'd been missing, a sense of belonging, of continuity, of being rooted in a story much larger than the moment she'd been taken. Healing didn't arrive in a single burst. It came like that old tide, slow and persistent. Not to wash things away, but to carry them forward, together. That winter, Emily and Jason took a trip together to visit their mother's hometown in Texas, a small place nestled between open fields and wide skies. Patricia had grown up there, and though much of the town had changed, some landmarks remained untouched by time. They walked through the old neighborhood where Patricia had once ridden her bike, visited the little white church where she'd sung in the youth choir, and stood beneath the oak tree in front of the house she grew up in. The current owners allowed them inside for a few minutes, after hearing their story. Emily wandered through the living room slowly, brushing her fingers across the faded windowsill, whispering that it somehow felt familiar even though it couldn't possibly be. They spent that night in a quiet motel nearby, flipping through a scrapbook Jason had brought along, one their mother had started in the early 80s. Inside were birthday cards, pressed flowers, bits of wrapping paper taped beside handwritten notes. Emily sat cross-legged on the bed, reading every page carefully, her eyes wide and wet. She didn't recognize the handwriting or the faces in the photos, but she felt the care and joy tucked into every corner. She said it felt like opening a window that had been painted shut for too long. Jason said he'd often wondered what Patricia would have been like if she'd had the chance to grow older, to become a grandmother, to sit with Emily years later and tell her stories about that road trip they never finished. Emily didn't respond right away. She was holding a photo of herself as a toddler, grinning up at the camera with sticky fingers and cake on her cheeks. When she finally spoke, it was to say that she didn't want her mother to be remembered only for the way her life ended. She wanted people to remember her laugh, the warmth in her eyes, the small kindnesses she'd tucked into her children's lives like hidden treasures. They sat quietly for a long while after that, the hum of the motel heater filling the silence. In that moment, grief and love wove themselves together into something steady, something that could last, something they would carry, side by side. In early spring, nearly 2 years after the car was discovered behind the billboard, a small memorial was held on the land where Patricia's Dodge Aries had rested hidden for so long. The area had been cleared and transformed into a quiet green space, with wildflowers growing along the edge of the service road and a single wooden bench placed beneath a young tree. It wasn't an official park, but local volunteers and a few sympathetic county officials had made sure the ground would no longer be forgotten. Jason and Emily chose not to make the ceremony public. Just close friends, a few extended family members, and the investigators who had never stopped caring. Jason spoke first. He kept it simple. He thanked everyone for being there, for carrying pieces of the story with them. Then he stepped aside and let Emily take her place at the front, a printed photo of Patricia held gently in her hands. Her voice trembled at first, but she steadied it. She spoke not just about the tragedy, but about the pieces of her mother she was rediscovering every day. The way she'd sung to her, the softness of her hands, the love she'd managed to pour into such a short time. Emily said she still didn't remember everything, but she remembered enough to know she had been loved, and that was something worth honoring. After the short speeches, Jason and Emily placed a small plaque in the ground near the tree. It read, "For Patricia Moore, a mother, a light, and a voice that still echoes in those who remember." Beneath it, a single wildflower was pressed into the soil. They stood back and watched the breeze move through the grass. There was no applause, no dramatic close, just silence and the feeling of something settling, something long overdue finally finding its place. Later that afternoon they sat together on the bench, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun slip low behind the trees. They talked about nothing in particular. Books, dinner plans, the changing weather, the kind of small, ordinary things that once felt impossible but now meant everything. Not because they filled the silence, but because they made space for life again. Gently and without needing to ask, they simply stayed. Years passed, not quickly, but with a steady rhythm that surprised them both. Emily returned to school, finishing her degree in psychology and taking a job with a nonprofit that supported victims of long-term abduction and identity displacement. She didn't tell her full story often, but when she did, it was always quiet and measured, focused less on the pain and more on what came after. She had learned not to run from the past, but to carry it carefully, like something fragile that could still be shaped into something meaningful. Jason finished the book he had been writing, weaving their story with care and restraint. It was published under a simple title, What Remained. The reviews were kind, thoughtful. Readers connected not just with the mystery, but with the endurance, the way grief and healing had to live beside each other without competing. He never went on a book tour, never sought a spotlight. For him, it had always been about memory, about reclaiming the years that were nearly lost for good. On the anniversary of Patricia's disappearance, they met again at the memorial site. This time, it was just the two of them. The tree had grown taller, its branches reaching wider, casting a longer shadow across the bench below. Emily brought a new photo, one of her and Jason laughing in the kitchen while baking their mother's biscuit recipe. She slipped it into a small frame and tucked it near the plaque. For a moment, they just stood there, quiet. Then Jason took a breath and began telling her a story he'd just remembered, about Patricia getting a flat tire outside a grocery store and laughing so hard at the jack instructions that she sat down on the pavement in the middle of the parking lot. Emily smiled, picturing it, and then laughed too. They sat on the bench until the light began to fade. There was no rush to leave. The years had taught them that closure isn't a door that shuts or a finish line you cross. It's a slow return to stillness, a place where the pain softens, where memory holds its shape without hurting, where presence becomes enough. And there, beneath the tree, with the wind carrying old echoes forward into a new season, they stayed together, always.